Section 8 represents a bit of a transition because we're starting to get into the details of the customs clearance process itself. We're going to set the stage for that detailed conversation by providing an introduction to U.S. and Customs border protection, and towards the end of this section, we'll start on some of the definitions that we just need to really understand in order to get the most out of this module. The U.S. Customs Service, as it was originally called, was established when George Washington signed the Tariff Act of July 4th, 1789. 1789 is the same year that the Constitution was ratified and went into place, when the U.S. really became a country. What that did, that Tariff Act, was to allow for the collection of duties on imported goods, which, as we'll see in a moment, was not only the main source of revenue for the United States, it was the only source of revenue for the United States. Second bullet point, for the first 125 years of its existence, it was U.S. Customs that funded all government activities. Interesting perspective on history here. Things like the Louisiana Purchase, the Oregon Territory, and the purchase of Florida and Alaska were all financed with customs duties. Same can be said for the Transcontinental Railroad, our lighthouse system, the U.S. military and naval academies at West Point and Annapolis, respectively, and the whole city of Washington, D.C. was paid for with import duties. And by 1835, the national debt was down to zero. We won't comment much on that, but my, how things have changed. Fast forwarding on the timeline a little bit, prior to 9/11, the primary responsibilities of customs were pretty clear. Administer the Tariff Act of 1930, which was a big piece of legislation that came in right around the time of the Great Depression, actually, which empowered the then called U.S. Customs Service to assess and collect duties, also to compile trade statistics, and determine any other legal requirements associated with entering goods into the commerce of the United States. There's that technical term we mentioned at the very front end of this module coming into play again. Unfortunately, tragically, much has changed since 9/11. And if you hadn't noticed already, the image on the right-hand slide of these slides is the updated name of what was previously called the United States Customs Service, U.S. Customs and Border Protection, U.S. CBP. After 9/11, because its role expanded, the U.S. Customs Service changed its name to U.S. Customs and Border Protection, CBP, as we have and will continue to call it. With the reorganization of the federal government after 9/11, CBP is now part of what was then the newly founded Department of Homeland Security. As far as tariffs and the collection of duties goes, CBP definitely still works with the Department of the Treasury for customs revenue purposes. Actually, when an individual receives a customs broker's license, it's through the Department of the Treasury. That hasn't changed any. What has changed is the expanded role of CBP in our national security. Sub-bullet, CBP is part of the Homeland Security Act of 2002. That was the federal legislation that reorganized our government in a more security-oriented way. And CBP is actually made up of a couple of divisions, a couple of different areas. That is the U.S. Customs Service, of course, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, and the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service. CBP continues to have the goal of protecting the import revenue of the United States, but the dual goal of facilitating trade, both import and export, by the way, and securing inbound supply chains. That's what CBP does. They do a very good job at it, and they're an important part of our overall federal infrastructure. Along with multiple other agencies, U.S. CBP is housed, as we said, within the Department of Homeland Security. That reorganization of the federal government that we saw after 9/11. Here's what we have under DHS, as it's called. And we can see the name DHS in the seal of U.S. CBP to the right, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. Who works under that umbrella? U.S. Customs and Border Protection, the TSA, the men and women that we see at our airports, the Transportation Security Administration, the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, ICE, as we hear of from time to time, the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, the U.S. Secret Service, too, small known fact there, FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and the Coast Guard. So this restructuring that we've spoken of a couple of times was really oriented towards putting together a framework that helped the government protect its citizens better. CBP is within that group. All right, now that we've had a little introduction and history lesson on Customs and Border Protection, we're going to get into what we like to call the grind. And that is the study of key terms and definitions that are just so important, not only to the customs clearance process, but to the understanding of what we're going to talk about in upcoming sections. We just can't get around it. We have to understand the terms and definitions. Otherwise, we won't get as much out of what we're going to be studying. Let's run through a couple here, and then we'll come back with 2 more sections that take us through all of the definitions that we have. Let's start by saying that not unlike most facets of global trade, the world of customs clearance has its own lexicon of terms and acronyms. Just terminology that is exclusive to the customs clearance process, and acronyms, an alphabet soup that is arguably unrivaled by any other facet of global trade. We'll be seeing lots and lots of acronyms here. Second bullet, given the detailed nature of U.S. CBP regulations and procedures, it's just impossible to understand the overall process without first defining certain key terms, going through that grind. As a quick note, the definitions found in this, as well as upcoming sections, are a combination of CBP and HTSUS official terminology, along with terms commonly used in the customs brokerage community. We'll call those out if it's a trade term versus an official regulatory term, but we want to make that distinction now as well. Let's start by saying that the 30-plus definitions we have coming up, unfortunately, are not an exhaustive list of customs-specific definitions. We're trying to set the stage as best we can, but if we went through all of the definitions specific to CBP, we'd be here for hours on end. We're going to hit the most important ones and set up a more detailed discussion for upcoming sections. We'll start with the A's and begin with anti-dumping duties. Duties being the import tax, sometimes referred to as a tariff as well. But customs duties are an import tax. Anti-dumping duties are additional duties levied on a product when it is determined that the price of an imported good is below its true market value or cost to produce. This is a situation when foreign countries, or even specific industries and individual companies, can be called out by the U.S. government for basically selling into the U.S. below their own costs to capture market share, and when there's no competition left, raise the prices. That's called ADD, anti-dumping duties, and they are punitive. We'll see examples as we proceed. ABI, the Automated Broker Interface. We talked a bit about the need to submit entries to U.S. Customs in an electronic format. ABI is the electronic format or interface used by CBP for the submission, review, and release of entries. A customs broker that submits entries on behalf of a U.S. importer has to have access to ABI. A U.S. importer that does their own customs entries, which they are entitled to do, would have to have an ABI connection as well. It's an electronic interface with customs. Automated Commercial Environment, also known as ACE. This is the single window, electronic portal, through which the U.S. government manages all import and export activities. ACE isn't new, but it's not old either. Customs has been working on perfecting ACE for some years now, but the automated commercial environment, the emphasis is on a single window. There aren't 20 different portals that an exporter or an importer now has to use to communicate with Customs and Border Protection, to communicate with partner government agencies. All import and export activity, it's a single window. It's an electronic format through which the government manages all import and export activities. We'll see lots more on ACE also. Moving on to the B's. There's only one, but it's called a binding ruling. And this is a CBP program through which importers can receive pre-entry classification decisions on a product. There are other types of rulings as well. For purposes of a succinct definition, we're going to go with this. We'll elaborate upon it later. But importers, especially dealing with new products or new product development, long before the goods come in and are assessed duties through a specific classification, that importer can approach customs, sit down with samples and catalogs and such, demonstrate essential character, intended use, and have a ruling, a pre-classification, if you will, on the product long before it gets imported. This helps dramatically with the calculations of landed costs long before goods enter the country. Classification. We've mentioned this a couple of times, and we'll see it repeatedly. It is the process of matching product descriptions with the numeric nomenclature found in the Harmonized Tariff Schedule of the U.S., the HTS-US. That's a short sentence, but a little bit technical. Building on what we've said previously, we as importers are going to use the commercial invoice from the overseas vendor to classify our goods. That invoice, of course, is made up of words, a prose-based description of a product. As we will see in multiple examples, the HTS-US allows us to take a product description and convert it into a numerical classification number, which, for U.S. purposes, is a 10-digit number. That's what we're talking about for classification. Again, many, many examples upcoming. Countervailing duties, CVD, sometimes confused with anti-dumping duties. They're completely different. What they do have in common with anti-dumping duties is that they're additional import duties levied on a product when it is determined that a foreign industry is being subsidized by its government. Right away, we can see the difference from ADD. Anti-dumping is selling into a market below cost. Countervailing duties are additional duties levied because a foreign government is subsidizing an industry so they can get into a foreign market and over time drive out all of the competition because they're operating at a lower cost due to the government subsidy. ADD and CVD are closely related, but they're not the same thing. We'll see examples on that, of course, in abundance. We're going to stop here so we can properly break up these sections. When we return, we'll address an acronym which is called CROSS. Exciting stuff, so we know that we don't have to tell you to come back soon.